All right, we are going to bring you back to a case that we watched very, very closely here on the Law and Crime Network. That's the Holly Bobo case out of Tennessee. The reason we're going to switch there is because the Birch case that we've been discussing just now wrapped up early because of inclement weather in Green Bay, Wisconsin. The climate in Green Bay this time of year is not always hospitable, I can say from personal experience. So the judge let the jurors go home early today. We're waiting to see exactly what's going to happen tomorrow because indeed there's more bad weather in the forecast tomorrow, but we'll take that when we get there. We have 3 live trials, potentially 3 as long as Birch comes back for you tomorrow here on Law and Crime. But we put together a documentary about the Holly Bobo case, the case of a young missing woman in Tennessee. She was a nursing student. There was one defendant convicted of killing her and another entered a guilty plea not terribly long ago. This documentary examines the first case. So without further ado, let's bring you back to the Holly Bobo case in Tennessee.
Unincorporated Darden, Tennessee is little more than a pit stop along Highway 412 in Decatur County. With a tiny community center, park, and rundown gas station, the only signs you're passing through. Winding roads cut through miles of quiet farm country.
911, what's your emergency?
Yes, I need Decatur County 911.
This is him. What's wrong, dear?
Listen, 681 Swan Johnson Road. Somebody has my daughter.
But on April 13, 2011, the quiet vanished.
Somebody in full camouflage got Holly.
20-year-old Holly Lynn Bobo, a beautiful young nursing student who wanted to devote her life to helping others, literally taken from her own home.
I grabbed her and took her to the woods. Please, get everybody out there.
Okay, they're on their way, sweetie. They're on their way right now.
The search for Holly would become the single most expensive missing persons investigation in the history of the state of Tennessee. Despite that massive effort, investigators and scores of volunteers would never find Holly. 2.5 years later, it was a ginseng hunter who stumbled on what turned out to be her remains.
I went with my instinct. When the feeling hit me, said turn around, and then that's when I found what I found.
What'd you find?
Holly's remains.
Well, what specifically did you find?
The skull.
But that gruesome discovery didn't answer the questions of how or who. It would still be another 3 years before anyone was tried for the murder of Holly Bobo. And even then, they had no direct evidence, and many admitted mistakes by law enforcement. So trying to bring Holly's alleged killer or killers to justice would be a long and difficult journey. One many believed would be a long shot.
This case was a very difficult one for prosecutors, and that's because it was almost entirely a circumstantial case.
No DNA, no fingerprints, a body that decomposed in the woods for years.
The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. We were feeding all of this information in, and we didn't realize what was there.
So many years later, with so many unanswered questions, how did prosecutors decide that this man, Zach Adams, kidnapped, raped, and murdered Holly Bobo? And most importantly, could they prove it? We take you inside the packed Savannah, Tennessee courtroom for the wild 11-day trial.
You have got everything possible to make this an interesting case, but most importantly, it's truly a whodunit.
Opening statements began 2,343 days after Holly Bobo first went missing. For seasoned Tennessee prosecutor Paul Hagerman, this was his first opportunity to tell the jury and the world exactly what they believed happened to Holly.
He took her. He raped her. He killed her. He discarded her. He covered it up. He bragged about it. And he almost got away with it. He bragged about Zach Adams.
So what was the key evidence? An eyewitness who claimed he saw much of it happen.
I couldn't have picked a prettier bitch. It was fun. The world may never know what happened to Holly Bobo. April 13th, 2011. April 13th, 2011. That's the day on Holly's headstone. That's the day that she was taken. Meth and morphine and the dark, dark things that go along with it. He had years to destroy evidence, to scatter evidence, to get rid of crime scenes, to build lies on lies. He had a 1.5 to 2 year head start. You can understand why he was so confident.
As soon as Hagerman was seated, Zach Adams' attorney Jennifer Thompson stood up and told the 6 men and 6 women of the jury a very different story.
So, members of the jury, Zachary Wright Adams is innocent of the 8 charges that he is facing here today. And it's worth saying it one more time, Zachary Wright Adams is innocent of all these charges. So how is it that we got here today? As a matter of fact, not only did Zachary Wright Adams, he did not murder Holly Lynn Bobo, he did not kidnap Holly Lynn Bobo, he did not abduct Holly Lynn Bobo, he did not rape Holly. He did not, as a matter of fact, know Holly Bobo and had never even laid eyes on her.
For Jennifer Thompson, she was telling the story of a devil in the community. And this was a community that she had to go back and live in. She had to buy her coffee there. She had to go out to breakfast there. She had to do her dry cleaning there. Jennifer Thompson's job was almost impossible. She had to tell the story of the devil.
And there were some major flaws with the prosecution's case.
This happens to be one of those tragedies in which somebody who was a good person, something bad happened to that person. However, Zach Adams is not the person who's guilty of this crime. This was the most expensive and most exhaustive investigation in the history of the state of Tennessee. And yet, when they came to 2013, they had nothing. They had a great big goose egg. They paid all this money and they had absolutely nothing to show for it. And the citizens of Decatur County, the family of Holly Bobo, and the public at large all wanted answers.
Making the showdown even more tense, the fact that before opening statements even began, there was major tension between the attorneys.
And went for months with no response from Ms. Thompson or her team saying, that's not true.
There was a lot of bad blood in that courtroom between defense attorney Jennifer Thompson, the judge, and the prosecutors long before this trial started.
That bad blood would flow in the form of frustration on both sides for the jury to see. And it wasn't just the behavior of the attorneys that was challenged. The defense overtly questioned whether the judge, Charles Creed McGinley, was biased against the defendant.
You've got accusations by the defense that the judge was not being fair to the defendant, may have even thought that the defendant was guilty, may have even insinuated that the defendant was guilty.
And whether he got too familiar with the jurors.
Do we have any Hardin County Tiger football fans? Wow. We might see if we can get you folks out there in the presence of guard. You understand you'll be isolated, but probably could put you on the visitor side. We play south side. If you want to go, there should be adequate place in this visitor side where we can put you without danger of exposure.
The judge is talking about sending this sequestered jury to a football game, as if that's not going to expose to everyone in these small counties as to who's on the jury. And then at the end of the trial, the judge is pointing out various members of the jury that he knew in passing or had a connection with personally. How is that impartial?
But perhaps even more difficult for the jury to ignore than courtroom bickering, emotion. From compelling testimony,
it sounded like boom, boom, boom underneath that bridge. It was just one shot, but it echoed underneath that bridge all the way down that damn river bottom.
He said he would tie me up just like he did Holly Bobo and nobody would ever see me again.
But did he say what had happened to her body before that?
It had got chopped up.
To a community desperate for a conviction, how would the jurors sort out what really happened? Coming up, Holly Bobo's mother takes the stand, testimony that rocks the courtroom.
And I guess I called Clint back, but I don't really remember now if it was from the library phone or the office phone, and he was still talking about, was Holly not going to school today when she turkey hunting with Drew? And I said, that's not Drew, and at some point I said, get a gun and shoot him. And I remember Clint.
On the morning of April 13, 2011, 20-year-old Holly Bobo was taken from her home in rural Decatur County, Tennessee. Zach Adams, a local drifter, was charged over 5 years later, but many questions remained about whether he was the real killer. The first witness called by the prosecution, James Barnes, a neighbor who was a critical ear witness.
About 7:50, sometime like that, I heard some arguing going on next door, so I kind of looked through the trees to see what was going on and couldn't see anything at all. And she started screaming a little, and then she quit.
You actually got a cold chill.
Oh yeah, my hair stood up everywhere, and I looked around, and every one of my dogs, they were on the ground, their ears were up.
That would be the last time anyone, other than the killer or killers, would hear from the beautiful young nursing student. Her mother was the one to call 911.
681 Swan Johnson Road. Somebody has my daughter.
So when Karen Bobo took the stand, the courtroom was captivated. She wasn't just a witness for the prosecution, she was mom.
The secretary of the school came to the cafeteria and she said that the neighbor had called and said she didn't want to alarm me, but she thought she heard screams coming from the house. So that's not a phone call that I got every day. I'd never gotten a phone call like that, so I almost instantly got into a panic at that point.
Immediately, Karen called home.
And I asked my son Clint what's going on. And he said, did Holly not have school today? And I said, yes, why? And he said, well, I think she's out here with Drew.
Drew was Holly's boyfriend at that time. But that morning, a mother's instinct kicked in. Karen knew something wasn't right.
And I don't know what made me say it. This instant panic came over me, and I said, that's not Drew. Call all the neighbors, I think is what I said. And then I ran over to the office, and I called 911. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I remember they said it was Henderson County. We live in Decatur County, so I hung up. I think I fell on the floor at that point. And I guess I called Clint back, but I don't really remember now if it was from the library phone or the office phone, and he was still talking about, was Holly not going to school today when she turkey hunting with Drew? And I said, that's not Drew, and at some point I said, get a gun and shoot him.
Karen described how she and a friend rushed to get home. The frantic 911 call the jury would not forget.
Somebody in full camouflage got Holly. They grabbed her and took her to the woods. Please, get everybody out there.
Okay, they're on their way, sweetie. They're on their way right now.
By the time Holly's father, Dana, arrived at his home, it was already a crime scene.
The yard was full of people, cops and people, and I had to drive on past her. I was in a terrible big hurry, and I had to drive on past all that and go down on the side of the road where the county used to park their work equipment, and I had to park down there and run back to the house. First person I saw that I thought I needed to talk to was my son, Clint. Then I went inside and I found my pistol, and I come back outside with the pistol.
Was the pistol loaded?
Yes, ma'am.
Did TBI come?
TBI was there
Did FBI come?
FBI was there. U.S. Marshals was there.
So U.S. Marshals, FBI, TBI.
A SWAT team. I remember them pulling up. It was people wandering, standing, fiddling, just like nobody. No, it was kind of like nobody knew what to do. That's the way I took it at the time.
At some point in the middle of the morning, did you lose patience with an FBI agent and tell him what he should go do? What did you say?
I couldn't tell you who it was.
That's all right.
I told him, if y'all think one of us done it, I was talking about me and Clint and Karen that was still out there. I said, if y'all think one of us done it, 10 of y'all stay here with us and the rest of you go do something. And it probably wasn't that nice of words when I said it.
But you wanted somebody to do something.
Yes, ma'am.
You wanted Holly?
Yes.
Back.
Immediately.
That moment was the beginning of the family's frustration with law enforcement. But it would be Karen Bobo's reaction to seeing her daughter's belongings for the first time in over 6 years that brought the trial to a stunning halt.
Did Holly have an inhaler?
Yes, you did. Take just a minute, I'm feeling sick.
Let's take a recess. I want everyone to remain with me while the jury files out, please.
In a moment rarely seen, even in a murder trial, Karen Bobo passed out mid-testimony. The courtroom, from observers to lawyers to jurors, stunned. The defense immediately demanded a mistrial.
It's going to be impossible for her to get a fair trial, for Mr. Adams to get a fair trial from an impartial jury. I think they're so tainted at this point.
The judge refused the request.
This was clearly a medical event. There's no question. This was not something faked to gain sympathy.
After seeing this, could these jurors set aside their feelings?
This is hard in any case, but in the case of Holly Bobo, which was so compelling and so sympathetic, it was almost impossible for those jurors to decide the case without any sympathy whatsoever.
The last family member the jury heard from was Holly's older brother, Clint. And it was his testimony that raised as many questions as it answered. Clint would testify that on the morning that Holly disappeared, he woke up to the family dog's barking.
As I was approaching that window, I heard voices. I raised the blind slightly, and I saw the silhouette of two individuals underneath that window knelt down. At first, I didn't recognize either voice, but as I listened for just seconds, I could recognize my sister's voice and what I thought was her boyfriend Drew's voice.
He went on to explain he still thought the man with Holly was Drew when his mother called.
She said, "Oh my God, Clint, that's not Drew. Get a gun and shoot him."
But shortly after Holly's disappearance, investigators considered Clint Bobo a possible suspect.
If Clint Bobo was in the house, why didn't he hear his sister scream? Why was it the neighbor who called for help?
Coming up, a witness's account of what Clint Bobo was really doing the day Holly disappeared surprised everyone. When Holly Bobo was taken from her home on the morning of April 13, 2014, it was this man, Zachary Adams, a local junkie, who was ultimately charged with her murder. But there were many concerns in this small, rural Tennessee community about investigators' bungled investigation and whether Adams was the real killer. Holly's brother, Clint, was one of the last to see her alive, and he was initially questioned by police as a possible suspect.
So I left where I was standing and I walked over to the back door, and that's when I saw a male and a female walking towards the woods, and I recognized the female as my sister, and at this time still thought the male was Drew.
Some say Clint's testimony in this packed Savannah, Tennessee courtroom 6 years later would leave more questions than answers.
The man that I saw I would describe as about 5'10", 5'11" in height and about 200 pounds in weight.
Would you agree with me that that is
not the same physical size or stature of Zach Adams?
I would.
That is not, correct?
That is not.
After all, it was Zach Adams on trial for kidnapping, raping, and murdering Holly. But the description that Clint initially gave to police matched someone else.
Ultimately, Clint Bobo said he saw Holly near the woods with someone who doesn't match the description of defendant Zach Adams, who was on trial here.
Even the prosecution's star witness would later raise questions about Clint.
What did Zach, or how did Zach respond?
He said the real reason that we were there was to show Clint how to manufacture meth. He said we got there early, she come outside screaming and raising hell, and we took her.
Questions investigators were never really able to answer, and yet they ruled Clint out as a suspect.
And I asked
By 2011,
Clint,
the same
"What's
year
going
Holly
on?"
went missing, her mother, Karen Bobo, had received tips on 4 other possible suspects. Zach Adams, who would eventually be tried for her murder, Dylan Adams, his brother, and their friends, Shane Austin and Jason Autry. She turned those tips over to investigators, and all 4 were eventually indicted. But Austin killed himself, Autry became the star witness, and Zach Adams' brother Dylan is still awaiting trial. But the question remains, why did it take prosecutors 3 years for an indictment? On the stand, Special Agent Brent Booth, who later came to head up the investigation, admitted his agency was partly to blame.
The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. We were feeding all of this information in, and we didn't realize what was there. Their alibis or their stories were not checked out.
Not
thoroughly.
checked out. Was it a mistake?
Yes, it was a mistake.
Was it a bad mistake?
Yes, sir.
Is it 3 years later you figure out how bad it was?
Yeah.
When Holly Bobo first disappeared, they didn't thoroughly investigate those 4 defendants, including Zachary Adams. They didn't thoroughly look at their alibis, and that was a major mistake.
A mistake the defense argued should cost the prosecution its case. Zach Adams' attorney Jennifer Thompson claimed that investigators pinned Holly's brutal murder on her client simply because they were desperate to hold someone, anyone, responsible.
This was the most expensive and most exhaustive investigation in the history of the state of Tennessee. And yet, when they came to 2013, they had nothing.
In fact, the biggest mystery, the location of Holly Bobo's body, wasn't solved by law enforcement, but instead was stumbled upon by a local man.
What'd you find?
Holly's remains.
Well, what specifically did you find?
The skull.
Once that happened, the state went into overdrive in an effort to solve the case. But so many years later, prosecutors weren't able to find any physical evidence linking the suspects to the crime. So to bolster their case against Zach Adams, prosecutors needed eyewitnesses. First, they called Adams' ex-girlfriend, Rebecca Earp, to the stand.
Did he make any statements to you about Holly Bobo?
Yes, sir.
And what did he say?
He said he would tie me up just like he did Holly Bobo and nobody would ever see me again.
But Adams' attorney tried to prove that Earp wasn't remotely credible, that she did drugs and might certainly have a foggy memory.
To be clear, Rebecca, I mean, just to be honest, back in the day, you were using meth also, weren't you?
Yes, ma'am.
And you were using a lot of Xanax, weren't you?
Yes.
Plus, they said she had a motive to lie.
You specifically remember that Valerie Trout, a TBI agent, came to talk to you at your mother's house, don't you?
Yes.
And at that time, she threatened to take your unborn baby away from you and put it in DCS custody, didn't she?
Yes.
But prosecutors also called at least 3 other witnesses who recalled Adams bragging about killing Holly, including jailhouse snitch Corey Rivers.
He was like, you know, I was there for the worst of it. And I was like, well, did you do it? And he was like, I was there for the worst of it. And he just left it like that.
Did he tell you what had happened to her body?
Yes, Mom, he did. He told me that the bottom side was found in one part of Tennessee, and then some other pieces was found otherwhere.
But did he say what had happened to her body before that?
It had got chopped up.
With no direct evidence and limited other witnesses, the prosecution's case would really turn on the words of one man, Jason Autry, who said he was there right after it happened.
And it sounded like boom, boom, boom.
Coming up, would the jurors believe his story? In September 2017, 6 years after the disappearance of nursing student Holly Bobo, Zach Adams would go on trial for her kidnapping, rape, and murder. After years of false leads and dead ends, there were still many remaining questions, including whether they had the right man. The key witness for the prosecution? A guy who clearly had a motive to lie.
And it sounded like boom, boom, boom. Underneath that bridge. It was just one shot, but it echoed underneath that bridge all the way down that damn river bottom.
After years and years of proclaiming his innocence, Jason Autry cut a deal with prosecutors, now telling jurors he was there when Holly Bobo was killed and named Zach Adams as the trigger man. Autry testified that when he arrived at his friend Shane Austin's home, Shane, Zach Adams, and his brother Dylan had already kidnapped and raped Holly Bobo.
I pulled into the driveway, and I got out. The first thing I noticed was a burn barrel that was burning. The second thing was Dylan was standing in the doorway with his shirt off. Shane was walking around saying, "Y'all need to hurry up and get the goddamn hell out of here," and holstered on his side was a firearm.
Then he claimed Zach Adams asked him for help.
He asked me would I help him bury the body, and I said yeah. As we got going down the road, I brought it to his attention that there were no shovels or pickaxes in the truck. How are we going to bury a body with no shovels or pickaxes? He looks at me and like he's lost. And I said, I don't know of nowhere a man can just pull up and get a shovels and pickaxes with a dead body in the vehicle. I told him that some years back that I had been underneath Interstate 40 bridge and there was a body floating. And I told him, I said, the only thing holding the body up was the intestines.
Autry testified they drove to this desolate and abandoned spot next to the Tennessee River.
What was your plan of disposing of Holly's body?
Was to gut her, put her in the deep end of the slough. I told him, I said, you put her in the deep end of that slough, turtles and shit, eat it up, just like that.
What Autry says happened next left Holly's family and this entire Tennessee courtroom horrified.
I'm standing over the top of her, my hands on my knees. She being right here. And at that time, I see the foot move, a movement, and a sound of distress that sounded like, come out of her voice, come from the blanket. At that time, I walked to the door. I told him, I said, this fucking bitch is still alive. And I told Zach, I said, she's heard my name called and heard me talking and all. At that time, he wheels around, walks back to the driver's side pickup, out of the floorboard of pickup, he pulls a pistol, the same pistol that was holstered on Mr. Austin's side at 30 Yellow Springs Road. I looked around and I told him that there was nothing coming close as clear, something to that effect. And at that time, boom, the gun sounded, the gun went off. And it sounded like to me But it shot 3 or 4 times underneath that bridge. I had done made it back. I had done started my way back this way. And it sounded like boom, boom, boom underneath that bridge. It was just one shot, but it echoed underneath that bridge all the way down that damn river bottom.
Autry claimed that after the shot was fired on that spring morning in 2011, they put Holly's body back in the truck, and Zach Adams dropped him off at his car. But there were serious holes in the star witness's story. For one, Autry was unable to explain what happened when Holly was taken from her home and where her body was discarded after she was killed. Adams' attorney Jennifer Thompson seized on those discrepancies and pointed to the fact that he was admittedly high on drugs at the time.
Once that euphoria kicked in, you could probably say that my track of time was affected, altered.
So you're saying that these drugs affect your mind and your thinking?
Yeah.
Jason Autry was the key to the case. He was a terrible human being. He was a drug dealer. He was, in fact, a huge part of this crime. And yet the jurors had to believe him in order to find that Zach Adams was guilty.
Just as the prosecution's case came to a close, another possible suspect was introduced to the jury, a convicted sex offender with a predilection for young, blonde women, women who looked just like Holly Bobo.
Did you kidnap, rape, murder Holly Bobo?
When we come back, this convicted sex offender cornered as he takes the stand. Twenty-year-old nursing student Holly Bobo disappeared from her Tennessee home on April 13, 2011. 6 years later, Zachary Adams would finally stand trial for her rape and murder. But many were convinced they had the wrong man. As soon as Holly disappeared, law enforcement began interviewing local sex offenders. Their attention turned to this man, Terry Britt, known in the community as Chester the Molester, and an early suspect in the case. Not only did he have a shaky alibi, Britt had a history of going after beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed women. Women who looked just like Holly.
Did you kidnap, rape, murder Holly Bobo?
No, I didn't. I ain't no girl.
In an effort to eliminate any questions about his involvement, prosecutors called Britt to the stand.
Were you charged with anything to do with Holly Bobo's case?
No, ma'am.
The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation spent weeks focusing on Britt.
We looked at him hard.
What'd you do to take apart his life?
Surveillance, physical surveillance. We wiretapped his phones.
That means y'all listen to phones and he doesn't know it.
Yes, sir. We executed search warrants on his house, property.
After all that,
we didn't find anything related to Holly.
With no physical evidence linking Britt to Holly's murder, investigators dropped him as a suspect. The evidence they did have included cell phone pings, and that, prosecutors say, once again linked the local town druggie Zachary Adams to Holly Bobo's location the morning of her abduction. They brought in a cell phone expert to explain.
we start getting her cell phone pings in the Yellow Springs Holiday area, 3 of them.
That's right.
Over a period of time. Over that period of time, Zach Adams' phone is utilizing the same tower.
Yes.
The prosecution would claim those pings, which linked Zachary Adams to Holly, also supported testimony from the prosecution's key witness, Jason Autry.
Zach Adams and Jason Autry were communicating via telephone the morning Holly Bobo disappeared. And then Holly Bobo and Zach Adams' phones were found in the same area according to the cell phone records. So you've got a star witness communicating with a defendant in the same area as a victim, and then later the star witness and the defendant in the area where the body was apparently disposed. That evidence, from the state's perspective, triangulated exactly what happened to Holly Bobo.
Shortly thereafter, the prosecution rested, and the defense wanted jurors to focus again on Terry, that sex offender, with the shady past and predilection for blondes.
Now, when the police showed up at your house to talk with you, the first thing you said to them was, "I didn't rape nobody," didn't you?
Right.
And that's before they even said anything to you about what was going on, isn't it?
That's right.
Okay. Because you had already heard that there was a woman missing.
That's right.
Their first witness, the former lead investigator in the case, now taking the stand for the defense.
We spoke to Zach Adams and his brother Dylan, and then at the end I called Rebecca Earp.
After you talked with her, what determination did you make?
That I was wasting my time.
Wasting your time doing what?
Investigating these idiots.
Terry Dykes, formerly with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, or TBI, and now a local attorney, told jurors that he believed Terry Britt was the real killer. In fact, the Bureau took him off the case for having what they called tunnel vision.
He is the exact size of what our witness said the abductor looked like. Okay? His history tells me he's capable of kidnapping her.
To this day, Dykes is convinced that investigators not only botched the investigation, but arrested the wrong man. In all, the defense called a total of 14 witnesses to challenge the cell phone evidence, offer additional alternative suspects, and generally try to poke holes in the prosecution's case. And it is the prosecutors who have the burden to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Closing arguments were the attorney's final chance to speak directly to the jurors. And prosecutor Paul Hagerman stood up and insisted that all of the evidence, the cell phone pings, Zach Adams allegedly bragging about the crime, and most importantly, their star witness's account, all pointed to one man.
It's time to do what is right. It's time to listen to the evidence, to make decisions on the evidence, what matters. Time's now.
After just a 44-minute closing argument, it was the defense's turn. And Jennifer Thompson wanted to make sure jurors focused on the evidence that wasn't there and the other possible suspects.
Zachary Wright Adams is 100% innocent of the charges he is facing in this case. And the important thing for you to remember today is that non-evidence is not evidence in this case.
Coming up after 11 days of testimony, the jury reaches a verdict. On September 22, 2017, if you lived anywhere near Decatur County, Tennessee, you were probably anxiously awaiting the verdict in the trial of a man accused of killing 20-year-old nursing student Holly Bobo.
They very well may have the right person. Zachary Adams may have killed Holly Bobo. But there's a different standard in a court of law. In my opinion, there is reasonable doubt that maybe, just maybe, Zachary Adams was not Holly Bobo's true killer.
A case that took 6.5 years to bring to trial. 11 days more in front of a jury, and 11 additional hours for those jurors to reach a decision.
But has the jury reached a verdict in this case? I want you to pass the verdict forms to me, please, through the bailiff or the sheriff. All right, I'm going to start with count 1, verdict form. First degree felony murder of Holly Lynn Bobo during the perpetration of or attempt to perpetrate kidnapping of Holly Lynn Bobo. You checked guilty of first degree felony murder of Holly Lynn Bobo during the perpetration of or attempt to perpetrate kidnapping of Holly Lynn Bobo.
Zach Adams convicted, now facing the possibility of the death penalty.
It seemed to me going into this case that it probably would be a conviction. There's a sympathetic victim and very unsympathetic defendants, including the defendant who was on trial in this instant case. They're just not the sort of people that that community would look favorably upon. In my experience, smaller communities tend to be more trustful, more trustworthy when it comes to police investigations. So the police point at a suspect, smaller communities say, let's convict.
I trust the jury system, and I believe that they do the best they can in the circumstances they are dealt. I think they listen to the facts, I think they listen to the law, and I think that they come to appropriate verdicts 9 times out of 10. I don't like to second guess juries' verdicts. However, in this case, it's very hard for me to understand the verdict that they came to with the facts they were presented and knowing that the burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt.
With the trial behind him and the possibility of death in front of him, Zach Adams finally did what he swore he could not: admit that he killed Holly in exchange for a sentence of 50 years without the possibility of parole, plus another 50 years. He spoke for the first and only time during sentencing.
I want you to stand, Mr. Adams. Raise your right hand. Solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, sir.
You've been present during this announcement. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Are you agreeing to this freely and voluntarily?
Yes, sir.
Anybody put undue pressure on you to force you to agree to this against your wishes?
No, sir.
Is this what you want to do?
Yes, sir.
All right. Court accepts the agreement.
There were a lot of questions in my mind at the end of this trial, and here's the thing. Do I think Zach Adams, his brother, Jason Autry, this group of people, do I think they were involved? I'm inclined to say that they were, but that's not the burden of proof. There was at least some reasonable doubt in this case.
But it was Holly's mother, Karen Bobo, who would have the final word, speaking directly to Adams, ordering the man now convicted of killing her daughter to look directly at her.
But I would like for Mr. Adams to look at me when I speak to him. I know that my daughter fought hard for her life. Can you back up just a little bit so he can look at me? And I know that she begged for her life because my daughter loved and enjoyed life. But you chose to take that from her. And you have shown absolutely, look at me please, you have shown absolutely no remorse for anything that you have done.
In the end, Karen Bobo and her family got the last word.
This was just really an amazing moment in court. You had the mom of the victim ask Zach Adams to look right at her, and he did.
And now Zach Adams is serving that time at the Morgan County Correctional Complex. A trial date has not yet been set for his brother Dylan, who's also charged for his involvement in the case.